I can barely go by with like when I'm speaking face to face with my friends in Japanese, let alone with older people. So sometimes I would just opt for just changing it to Indonesian instead of speaking in Japanese, because at the same time I don't really understand what they're saying.
So, moving on to the last section is
Yeah.
language culture. I really want to know what you think about language culture. When I say language culture, what goes on through your head?
Culture that is usually um, culture that is associated with that with a certain language. So, for example, Indonesian would obviously be the culture in Indonesia or Indonesian culture, traditions, and whatnot. Whereas for English, because it's a very global language, it's very difficult to define the culture. For Japanese, it's Japanese. Sometimes you would even say Indonesian. For German, I think it's German culture, I'd say. Yeah. Am I close?
There are some debates whether it's the culture that influences the language or the language that influences the culture, like how
Mm-hmm.
the language itself is embedded with culture. But what I want to approach and discuss here is like how, for example,
Mm-hmm.
Indonesian language culture may be like when you speak to an older person, you have to regard them in a certain manner.
Mm-hmm. Ah,
There are
yep.
levels like formal and informal. Like that's what I want to get
Mm-hmm.
on here.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of the
Yep.
upbringings.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to ask your opinion about first is Javanese language culture. Javanese and Indonesian is quite similar, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
in regards to how they interact with younger and older generations. There are certain manner of what you
Mm-hmm.
are allowed and not allowed to say. But how
Yeah.
would you
Uh-huh.
kind of define Javanese language culture as its own culture that is different from
Mm-hmm.
Indonesian?
Okay. Well, first of all, before I continue, I do want to mention that if it's not obvious enough, since I'm from Surabaya, my Javanese is very ngopo, harsh, I guess you would say. So it would probably be very different to somebody from Jogja, even though I studied in Jogja for a couple of years. But in terms of like treating older people, younger people, or people who are on your own age, I do agree with you. Actually, I do agree with you. Yes, in Japanese, we do have a very different way of addressing older people than we do address our friends. However, for me, myself personally, because I'm not very articulate with my Japanese, or I'm not very knowledgeable with my Japanese. Sometimes I can barely go by with like when I'm speaking face to face with my friends in Japanese, let alone with older people. So sometimes I would just opt for just changing it to Indonesian instead of speaking in Japanese, because at the same time I don't really understand what they're saying.
So, would you say that you struggle more with Javanese language culture than Indonesian?
Yes, I would say that.
Okay, so the next language that I want to ask is about the English,
All right.
specifically how Australian English may differ from other English
Ah,
languages in other countries.
yes,
What
the
would you say
best
is the
language.
main distinction of like an Aussie language?
Obviously the accent and the fact that Australian English really loves to abbreviate everything. Like for example, McDonald's becomes Macca's. Actually, fun fact,
Mm.
like here we in Germany, like sometimes McDonald's is also just written as Macca's. Almost like pretty
Oh,
close, but
okay.
not exactly the Australian Macca's, or like, cigarettes as Durries, often as Avo, that kind of stuff. Also very quite like how Surabayan Javanese is to the other Javanese speakers, very brash and brazen.
Mm.
Yeah. Um, I love the moment when I told my friends here in Germany that in Australia we very freely refer to other people with the C word. You know what I'm talking about. And they
Ah,
would think, oh my god, that's great. Yeah, but there is a not quite big, but not quite subtle, but visible enough lack of distinction between when you speak to an older person than to your peers for Australian English versus Javanese or Indonesian English.
Then the last language that I want to ask is German language culture. This is
Yeah.
very foreign to me, so please
Uh-huh.
explain. Give me like gambaran of what kind of culture is used in Germany.
Okay. Um, I don't know where to start. You wanna help me out with this? Or
Maybe you could elaborate more about the slangs.
uh, I'm not good enough in German to know the slangs. Yeah, I do know a little bit, but not really. Like for example, instead of saying like "How are you," I know how to say "What's up" in German, which is
Okay.
instead of "Wie geht's" is here, just say "Was geht." Or I don't know if this counts as slang language, but it's definitely a word that you won't you won't learn in school. Is, for example, I love this one. Backpfeifengesicht means a face that is in need of a punch. But anyways, I think German is I'd say it's I wanted to say it's an efficient language, but at the same time, it's not really. Perhaps I would say it's technical. So if
Mm.
you wanna say something technical, it can go through you. I think it kind of translates also very well to the people here. They're quite efficient as well. Mhm.
Mm.
However, you've obviously heard of the stereotype that German words are very very long. For example,
Mm.
actually, anyways, it's because there is this ability in German language called compounding. It's where you just basically take two words and you put them together. But
Mm.
that ability kind of is a trait of the efficiency. I'd say.
Then how would you compare the German language culture to like all the language cultures that you understood? Is it more similar to English, or does it also have like a certain degree of formalities like Indonesian?
Oh well, it's definitely a step higher than English because in German there are two ways of saying you, like you as in like one person to another. You can say du or you can say sie, and depending on which the grammar also changes, and that's what it's very difficult. But do is what you would use for to somebody who you're comfortable with or you don't really need to treat with respect, I guess you would say. Whereas for Z is
Mm.
yeah somebody like for example a teacher or a train conductor for example. Um, Ich habe eine Frage für Sie instead of ich habe eine Frage für du or für dich. I guess you could say it's similar to kamu versus anda. Although, yeah, like I said, the grammar changes like depending on which you use.
Or I also want to ask about the feminine and masculine in German
Oh,
language.
and neutral.
Yeah, that's a very new concept, right? From your previous
Mhm.
languages that you have learned.
Mhm.
How is it getting used to that?
It's difficult. Is to put it lightly, it's very difficult. I'd say if you don't meet the word often, you really have difficulties trying to memorize it. And in the end, most of the time, it just comes down to you memorizing it. For example,
Mm.
bus, is it Debbie das? Is it he, she, it? And thankfully, because I'm always here, I know that it's der Bus instead of die Bus or das Bus. Obviously, also learning grammar also helps, and you know anything that ends with an ung, for example, the responsibility, verantwortung, is always a D.
Yeah, so that's all the questions that I have,
All
actually.
right,
Thank you
okay.
for having a sit down.
Ja, gern geschehen. Bis dann und ya itu aja dari aku. Oh, hang on, let me say something in Japanese. What would I say in Japanese? I'm just trying to flex my
Your multilingual abilities.
multilinguality. Okay, yeah, schön gern geschehen. It was my pleasure. Sekian dari saya. Sepurane nek ono salah, pancen awak pancen ya whatever.
Well, a for effort again.
Hello, my name is Rido Arisha Putra, and currently I am 22 years old.
So what languages can you speak currently?
Today, right now, I only speak two, Bahasa and English, but when I'm in high school, I can speak three, Bahasa, English, and Germany.